Hello everyone, this is Frank Burzynski. I'd like to spend a few moments with you talking about my favorite topic, landscape photography. Certainly hope that pretty soon we'll all be back out on the trails and enjoying the great outdoors in Colorado. This first photograph is from Loveland Pass, and we're going to come back to that one later on, but it's an example of the grand landscape which I enjoy capturing. Some basic composition rules help with landscape photography. First one is the rule of thirds. You've probably heard about that, where you divide the frame into 9 equal quadrants, and you put the most important points of interest at those intersecting lines. In this case, the Teton Range, the largest of the massif on the right, and then the intersection of the water and the grasses on the bottom left. All landscape photographs work a little bit better if you can get a distinct foreground, middle ground, and background. And something of interest in the foreground is helpful as well. In this case, I chose the reflection of the clouds, made for some texture and interest in the foreground. The other thing I wanted to mention is that in a photograph, a diagonal line will be a lot more interesting than just a pure horizontal line. In this case, the Snake River serves that purpose as a diagonal line. There's also an interesting lead-in or leading line which directs your eye to the main subject, which are the snow-covered peaks in the background. Let's shift gears a little bit and go to Utah. Delicate Arch in Arches National Park has been photographed many times, of course, and lighting is going to be part of the topic here, as well as composition. Late afternoon light is going to bring out those richer tones. You've perhaps heard of the term the golden hour, which is just the hour right after sunrise and the hour right before sunset. And with modern camera sensors, you can even continue to shoot after the sun is not in the sky or before the sun's in the sky and get some nice deep colors. Here we are again with the rule of thirds. There is a rule in landscape photography to never bisect the frame with the horizon line. Don't put it right in the middle, because it makes for a static image. All these rules are actually just guidelines. In this case, I did put the horizon line right in the middle, but it's overridden by the arch in the foreground, which is a strong vertical element, so it really doesn't make the photograph static. And once again, you can see in the rule of thirds that the points of interest that I wanted to emphasize, the arch and that billowing cloud in the distance above those distant mountains, the LaSalle Mountains, are both of those power points, those intersecting lines on the top third of the left frame and top third of the right. When you're at a site that's been photographed many times, sometimes a little bit of preparation helps out. In this case, I did a little research and found out there was actually another arch that you could look through and photograph Delicate Arch. So with a little advanced planning, I scouted this out. You wouldn't ordinarily see it from the trail. And with a little scramble, got an interesting perspective that you don't ordinarily see of Delicate Arch. I was also able to use the bottom of the arch to crop out the crowds of people that were there that afternoon. So this is a spot in Summit County by Mayflower Gulch, which many of you have probably been to. We're back to the using a line and also shapes to draw the eye into the subject. So here we have those lines of the foundation of a cabin that no longer exists, those boards on the left that come into the frame and direct you towards the distant cabin. The backlit flowers, here we're sort of setting them against the shadow so that they really jump out, is also another element. And here we have two balanced elements, the bouquet of flowers and the cabin. They sort of offset each other from left to right. Once again, kind of a diagonal composition. Photos that tell a story are a little more interesting. So in this case, in addition to the peaks, the lighting wasn't perfect. The story of the mine site is really an integral part of what makes the photograph engaging. We're moving on to the San Juan Range. This is Ice Lake, and it's a beautiful aquamarine color created by minerals in the water. In this case, I used the trail itself as a leading line to bring you back to that distant peak. On the left is Pilot Knob. But there's actually more going on here. There's a convergence of lines, the ridge, the trail, and then sort of the diagonal of the lake itself all point to that peak in the distance of Pilot Knob. Here's another nice composition. Once again, foreground, middle ground, background. Leading line can be a sequence of objects. In this case, it's the flowers. This is Torrey Pines Preserve in San Diego. And these flowers create kind of a dotted line leading you down to the beach and the waves. Taking multiple shots of the same scene is also advisable. In this case, I took a few. I don't remember the exact number. However, in some cases, the waves were not breaking and there was very little definition in the ocean. So the photo that floated to the top, if you will, or became my favorite, was the one with the more foam in the surf, which creates a texture and a point of interest. The other item is the brightest item in a frame will draw your attention. So in this case, the surf is bringing your eye out to the ocean. Here's a favorite spot in Colorado many of us have been to, Hanging Lake. I understand now they have a lottery system. But once again, we have a leading line of this tree, bringing you out to the distant shore. And then hopefully your eye works back around to the right, and you see the actual falls. Here's a different perspective of Hanging Lake. There are some columbines, red columbine, which are fairly rare, along one part of the shore. So here I'm using a pretty wide angle view and getting very, very close to the foreground element to accentuate it. Now we're in Antelope Canyon near Page, Arizona. And here we're going to talk a little bit about shapes and S-curves. So S-curves are usually pretty pleasing to the eye. You can see on the bottom left kind of a gentle arc that sort of leads you into this chamber in Antelope Canyon. And then we have the contrasting textures. We have the sand on the floor and then the sandstone, the hard sandstone. And it also tells the story of how these canyons have been carved, the sand being the remnants of the water having broken down the rock. One more from that favorite place in Antelope Canyon. We have the same elements of shapes, the S-curve. We have a little less layering of rocks, but what we have, this was right at the very entrance, is we have the brightest part of the scene being in the distance. So it really draws your eye to that back, very front chamber where you first come into this magnificent canyon. Here we are in Emerald Lake, Rocky Mountain National Park in winter. Here we have shapes directing your attention. Once again, kind of the dotted line, only this time it's a couple of trees, the one in the foreground and the two in the middle ground. Also used the shadows to add some definition to the middle ground. Low angle of the sun in winter often makes for some very pleasing compositions if you position yourself in the proper orientation to it. Here it's coming in from my left of the south. And then the story. The snow blowing off the ridge. Many of us know how crazy windy it can be up there. So there's Dragon's Tail, the rock formation, but you can see a lot of snow up in the air, and it tells the story of how windy it was during that day. We're back to the Tetons real briefly. You can also use man-made objects as a leading line. I don't tend to do that too often, but here's an example of an S-curve being a dynamic leading line. Here we are in the Great Sand Dunes National Park. Topic here would be lines, shapes, and textures in the foreground for visual interest. So once again, I had mentioned early on about having an interesting foreground, and this is a fantastic place to get those elements. It's also a nice contrast to the distant mountains and the snow. The light on the second image is a little better, which is another point I wanted to make. Even if you set up the shot and you think you have the right elements, sometimes it pays to wait a few moments for slightly different lighting. Here there were clouds passing through, and the addition of the sunlit half of the scene on the right and the partially cloud-shaded image on the left really accentuates the textures and the depth of the dunes and how much of a distance it is between them and the Medano Peak in the distance. Back to golden hour, here we are with the unique perspective. We're actually outside of the park at first light. Often pays to kind of scout an area out. If you're going to be there overnight, get an idea where you would like to be when the sun comes up. So then you don't have to be hunting around in the dark trying to figure out what perspective you want. You know exactly where to set up. So there we have the Sangre de Cristo range, which is the primary subject, but it's nicely complemented by that one juniper tree in the foreground. It tells the story of how this mountain range in the distance has trapped the sand blowing across the San Luis Valley. And of course the beautiful first white and pink glow on the peaks in the distance make for a striking image. Here we're talking about contrast. We have contrast of light and dark. The peaks in the background are allowed to go pretty much hazy, and the exposure was set for the largest dune in the foreground, and I waited for a wind to be blowing some of the sand off the top. So it tells the story of how the dunes are constantly shifting and changing. This is an intimate landscape, macro. It's not exactly a macro photograph, but patterns in nature, often in a more intimate setting, can be engaging. In this image we have two. We have the flowers, these purple asters, and we also have the lichen, the repeating green growths on the rocks, and some orange ones as well. Sometimes breaking a pattern draws your attention to a subject. So in this case we have the pattern of the mule ears, and then the purple aster is the one non-conforming element that really stands out. So we have color, shape, and texture all helping to make that purple flower stand out. I make greeting cards once in a while, and this one was titled "You Sure Are Different," and you could mean that as a compliment or maybe just an observation. I'm going to talk a little bit about using different elements to frame the subject. So we're back at Mayflower Gulch, and this old mining building frames Jacques Peak in the distance very nicely. There's also tonal elements, the warm tone of the wood versus the cool tone of the snow and the high peak make for a nice contrast. Here we are at the Independence Ghost Town site. It's the original mining town prior to Aspen being founded. And looking through one of the buildings made for a different type of framing of some of the old structures that are still standing. It tells the story of what a harsh environment that was and the early efforts at mining in that area. Within Garden of the Gods there's an interesting little portal through some of the rocks where you can frame Pikes Peak. Early morning usually works best. In this case we have a circular composition, and we have some nice form and texture in the rock, and it all draws your interest into the majestic peak. Here's an image that's hanging in Denver International Airport right now, and it will be for about 2 years. This is Columbine and Sky. In the far distance is Handy's Peak. We're at Cooper Creek drainage in the Red Cloud Wilderness study area. And the swooping columbines really make the photograph. There's a diagonal line bringing your eye up to the sky, and a very beautiful cloud formation that afternoon. So this texture in the sky is very interesting. If there's not a lot of interest in the sky, I tend to try to minimize how much of the frame it has. In this case, I allowed the sky to occupy a significant part of the frame because of the beautiful textures. And it tells a story of just a warm, sunny, pleasant, high mountain afternoon. Here we have some sculpted clouds, and we have a silhouette where we're really exposing for the clouds, but we're letting the tree itself go dark. It's nice and simplified. So there's other elements in the foreground, but they really don't grab your attention because of the way it's exposed. What grabs your attention, hopefully, is the sculpting in the clouds from the wind that you often see in the fall and the winter in Colorado along the Front Range. This is the same tree from a different angle. This was used by Jefferson County Open Space Foundation for some of their promotional work. And this was really just a fortunate shot. I was actually coming down from the hill to avoid the lightning and decided to turn around and do some rapid fire exposures real quick. So I got down on a knee and managed to get this striking shot. We have the leading line of the trail bringing you up towards the lightning strike, and then the nice contrast with the form of the tree. I do like to do studies of trees. This one is up at Moraine Park in Rocky Mountain National Park. And one of the topics on this is being out in the elements sometimes makes for interesting photographs. The day of this hike, we were considering canceling because there was a forecast that there would be snow squalls spilling over the divide all day. We decided to go anyway, and I had my gear ready, and the storm was spilling over the divide, and as the sun was coming up, we got treated to a rainbow that lasted for about 2 hours. So you never know. It's always good to be out there as long as you're not in an absolute whiteout condition. Then there's not many photographic opportunities. We're back to the Snake River and the Tetons, as seen from Schwabacher's Landing. And here we're going to talk real briefly about where monochrome works, or black and white. You can concentrate more on the textures and the forms when you eliminate the color. And in this case, the clouds reflecting in the river were one of the primary elements. The little patch of blue sky kind of breaks up the clouds, so it sort of gives you a point of focus to start at. And then you have the slender grass reeds, which are also a textural element. And as you go further down the stream, you have some wind and beautiful little textures across the water. It sort of emphasizes the textures in this scene. And of course the clouds, beautiful formation and textures in the clouds, sometimes are emphasized using monochrome or black and white. It's easy enough in this era to try a conversion on your iPhone and your digital SLR. If you see a scene with a lot of textures, give it a try and see if you like what you get. Another example of black and white. We have the Keyboard of the Winds and Long's Peak in the distance. This is on the way to Dream Lake. It's just a little pool on the side of the road. I'm actually very, very low to the ground to accentuate the clouds reflecting in that puddle of water. This was on a CMC hike a while back with a bunch of our photographers from the photography section. I'll revisit that topic at the end of my presentation. This is one of the famous Bristlecone Pines. I love these trees. In this case, I used black and white to emphasize the wind-sculptured features of the tree. It actually will cut off circulation to branches when conditions are very, very harsh or super dry to survive. So these trees live for many hundreds of years. This is actually up on Chief Mountain. And in this case, the passing clouds, once again, not the greatest weather, but they assisted me because they blocked out that distant peak enough that I didn't have to worry about the radio antenna on top that has always been a distracting element when I've tried to get this photo in the past. This was used by Clear Creek Land Conservancy for some of their efforts to preserve open space in Clear Creek County. Here we're on the subject of macro. We're not really in the landscape arena any longer, but I just wanted to touch on macros briefly. Try to keep them simple and uncluttered. Focus is very critical, so sometimes a tripod is helpful. Shade and overcast skies, a day when maybe you don't have direct sun, is often a good time to look for macro compositions. In this case, we have a simple composition, some aspen leaves, and there had just been a fresh snow. This photograph tells a story. The yellow leaf obviously fell before the snowfall, and the orange leaf fell early morning after the snow. And a nice directional lighting that comes from the side lighting will often help emphasize textures, and in this case you get a very distinct view of the granularity of the snow on this log. One more macro image, a water lily. Once again, keep the composition simple and uncluttered. Focus is very critical, and this was a case where shade and overcast skies were helpful because you don't have the hot spots. Often a flower will come out too stark and too bright when it's a sunny day. You can also bring a diffuser and kind of soften the light if you really want to be serious about it. This is just a butterfly in Florida. Side lighting was still on the macro topic. Keep things uncluttered, good focus. Having a dark background will often, now we have direct sun, but positioning the subject against the dark background really helps it pop out. And the dark background being far in the distance will sort of be out of focus, so that's one way to compose on some macro shots when there is sunlight. Here we're dealing with the creative side a little bit. It was near Valentine's Day, and we were hiking up in Rocky Mountain National Park. And I'd been carrying around this stone that I had gotten on a trip to Italy with my wife. I was trying to make a Valentine's card. And Glacier Creek had these interesting frozen bubbles, and I finally found the right spot to place the stone and make my wife a little remembrance for Valentine's Day. Starburst off the heart is just a special effect done in camera. Modern cameras are just little computers, and if you drill into some of the menus, you'll find there's a lot of interesting filters and other effects that you can add. As long as they're not overdone, they can enhance an image. It's another item that I did in camera. This was on November 1st. It was an early snowfall, which is why you have fall colors as well as snow. We were just coming back from a trip overseas, and we got to Denver, and the temperature was 1 degree, and it had just snowed. And when we got home, this rabbit was out front, and this was taken through my front living room window. But I couldn't get an image with the color and the rabbit, so at least not to my satisfaction. There was a little bit of color. So what I did here was I combined two images. Double exposure was one way you would do that back in the negative film days. But in the digital world, I was able to do this in camera. I took two photos, one of the rabbit sitting in the snow, and then one slightly out of focus of the colorful leaves, and then in camera blended them together. That's a feature available in many Nikon camera bodies. Here's another example of a double exposure, or composite exposure as I call them. We're back in Arches National Park, and there are some petroglyphs there. They're newer items. They show people on horseback and some game, some hunting activities. I was at Arches, and I had taken a photo of the petroglyphs, and on the way down from Delicate Arch at sunset, there was a beautiful sky. So I have the sunset, and then I have the petroglyphs sort of dancing across the clouds, which I thought made for an interesting image. The story being the passage of time. At least that's what I hope to portray. I'll talk a little bit about moving water. It's much more pleasant to take when you have overcast skies or shadows. Having a tripod, you can take a long exposure, which creates that cotton candy effect of the stream flowing. This is Crystal Creek up by Spruce Creek Road in Breckenridge. I had seen the area earlier, and it was much too sunny and bright, and the image was not very pleasing. But I took note of that, and when we went out at dusk to take photographs, I came back and aligned this up. You have a pleasant S-curve leading your eye into the frame. This is on Mitchell Creek up in Indian Peaks Wilderness. These are Parry's Primrose, taken early morning before the hot spots would occur. If you had direct sun on the water, this image would not work as well. And by doing a longer exposure, this might have been close to a second, you get that nice flowing feature in the water, and it contrasts nicely the texture of that with the very solid rock, and then of course the delicate flowers. This is Lone Star Geyser in Yellowstone National Park. We're using that leading line again from the bottom left, bringing your eye into the frame. And when the geyser went off one winter afternoon, we were treated to a 20-minute show that included a beautiful rainbow. Because of the low angle of the sun in the sky in the winter, you often get this prismatic effect at the geysers in Yellowstone in the winter. Still on the topic of water, moving water, this time in full sun. You can't always predict what the weather will be, so you can adjust. In this case, I used a very fast shutter to freeze the water droplets in midair. A longer shutter speed with a tripod would have made this sort of a just kind of a visual jumble of information with a lot of bright spots. But going with a really fast shutter on shutter priority mode in my camera, I was able to freeze those water droplets, and it gives you an idea of the large volume of water that was spilling over that rock formation in the background. Once again, you have a foreground and a middle ground. The background is there also, but it's really fairly nondescript. I don't consider myself a wildlife photographer, but I'm going to touch on it real briefly. Once again, as we had talked about earlier, sometimes simpler is better. Safety first. You don't want to approach any wild animals in their comfort zone. So this was taken with a fairly robust telephoto lens. This is a bison in Yellowstone. It tells the story of survival. And the other thing is not only safety, but if you approach these animals too closely, they're expending energy trying to get away from you, energy that they need to survive through the winter. It tells the story of how these animals survive by digging in the snow. That's why his face has that snow cover on it. They are foraging for just meager rations of dried grass. Here we have a coyote hunting in winter in Yellowstone. Caught him in mid-flight. I like to keep the camera on continuous frame exposure. There's usually a C if you have a digital SLR, so that you can take multiple shots in a row. So I took about 5 of these, and I caught the animal right in flight, as well as when he came up with the vole that he had tracked down under the snow. Wildlife up on Mount Evans, many of you have seen that. Good telephoto lens. The wind blowing the animal's beautiful coat back tells you that it's windy and tells you what preparation the animal has to survive in that harsh environment. Eyes being in focus is a critical item for a good wildlife photograph. There's also a guideline that groups of 3 work better than groups of 2. So in this case, an elk family up near Estes Park, obliged by crossing the edge of the stream. And there's 3 of them, so your eye hopefully wanders from the female to the youngster to the bull and then back. This is a mother owl. Birds are very, very difficult. You need some special equipment. This one is fair. The warm light at dusk, I think, helps make the photograph, and the side lighting. And then taking multiple images, getting them to open their eyes, kind of the eye in focus theory again, makes for a more captivating image. Here's the 2 babies. They would not open their eyes for me until a red-winged blackbird came by and made a loud noise and facilitated my photographic efforts. Taking multiple images in the digital era is the best way to go. No exaggeration, it probably took me 60 or 70 shots to finally get the one that I liked of these 2 owl siblings. Birds in flight are a little bit easier. Once again, you want a fast shutter speed, maybe a 500th of a second, so that you freeze the motion. This was taken in Yellowstone in winter. Here we have first light on Ice Lake. We're talking about reflections right now. So I had scouted this out the night before and knew exactly where I wanted to be. We have the first light on the range in the distance. And similar to before, we have a leading line that's sort of a dotted leading line. These rocks in this small pond bring you out to the beautiful peaks in both the reflection and in the distance. Here, just local in Lakewood, Kendrick Lake, a winter sunset. We have a log in the water that draws you in and gives some contrast to the scene. Moon photographs are a little more difficult. You do need a fairly robust lens. Locking up the mirror on your digital SLR will reduce the amount of shake on the camera. And you pretty much have to do a little bit of work on manual exposure to get the exposures right, because they'll vary quite a bit. Here the moon is setting over Mount Evans. It's taken from Green Mountain in Lakewood. Star photography is another fun challenge. Grand landscape plus the heavenly landscape. I tend to shoot with a super wide angle lens. This was about 25 seconds with a super wide angle lens. I did leave some foreground elements. For moon or star photographs, I find that if you do have some elements of the earth involved in the photograph, it gives you some context. It's not the main part of the image, but it adds to the image. In this case, I even included the tree, which has a little bit of parallax distortion, but it does point your eye up towards the beautiful Milky Way. And I was just fortunate to get a streaking meteor across the sky at the same time. This was taken up by Francie's Cabin near Breckenridge. Once again, a moon photo by Red Rocks Park. This is Dakota Ridge in the distance, and the moon almost appears to have gotten caught in the branches. So have fun. I like to take people photographs, especially if they're engaged in activity. Here are two fellow photographers with Father Dyer Peak in the background. I didn't locate them dead center. Off center usually works a little bit better. And they were discussing some photographic topic. And I said, "Hey guys," and they looked up and we got a good photo of them engaged in their craft. We have what I call dancing trees, and I love this image, but when I took it I realized this is a nice spot to set up some people photographs when we were doing the hut trip 2 weeks later. This is up near Shrine Mountain Inn. So that is what I did. The lighting wasn't as complimentary that day, but it added a nice offset to the people, so we got portraits of anyone who wanted one with the 10-mile range and the Copper Mountain ski area in the background. Here's a quick plug for the CMC Photography section. We meet the second Wednesday of every month at 7 p.m. We've been doing virtual meetings right now. Normally we meet in Golden at the American Mountaineering Center. You can find information about us on the Denver CMC website. And here's a group of us after enjoying a winter outing and potluck up in Silverthorne a couple of years ago. Self-portrait, interesting concept that I wanted to develop. We have Mount Evans in the background, and I was trying to reflect my love for the state of Colorado. So I set this up on a tripod and had a friend of mine press the shutter. It has, once again, that horizontal line element, which I planned, my left arm leading up to the flag. So it has a little bit more dynamic composition than something that would be just straight across left to right. I'm also wearing my vest that I got when the Mountain Club celebrated 100 years, and it reads 100 years up high. Excuse me, this is a variation of that image I took earlier, only as a composite I added one more layer. So thank you for your attention and time. I was going to revisit real quickly that very first image now, where you put it all together, and then I'll wrap up. So here we are at Loveland Pass, and we have the foreground, middle ground, and background, as I've been talking about. And I like to get lower to the ground, which helps accentuate the foreground. But it's very important to get a foreground that has some interest. In this case, the alpine sunflowers serve that purpose very nicely. Once again, we have balanced images of the alpine sunflowers on the left side of the frame, and then the peaks in the distance, the citadel And I also waited for some cloud cover. So this is back to getting your composition the way you want it, and then maybe waiting for the light to change. As you can see, there's a shadow cast right below the citadel, which I think helps accentuate that rock formation in the distance. The other advantage to shooting low is the middle ground becomes less prominent. So you see a little snowfield in the middle ground, which helps bring you into the photograph. But when I was standing up and taking the photograph, the middle ground was a very large part of the frame. So experiment with that, moving up and down, getting real low to your foreground elements, using a small shutter so that you have great depth of field from the foreground all the way to the background of the peaks. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and maybe we'll see you at a photography section gathering. Enjoy your travels out there. Thanks for your time.